What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Welcome to Truth Be Told, where we believe and experience becomes truth.
What's your
I'm your host,
thoughts
Tony
on
Sweet,
government cover-ups
along
or
with
covert
world-renowned psychic
societies attempting to
Eddie
control
Connor
humanity?
and multiple Emmy-winning journalist Anna Garcia. Thank you for supporting our sponsors,
Do you believe
Earth-Friendly
in
Products.
ancient
For over
astronauts,
40 years,
intergalactic
Earth-Friendly
communication,
Products have
or
brought you the
extraterrestrial
greenest home products
visitations?
for all your family needs. Go to ecos.com, that's ECOS.com.
And take your mind on a literary journey while you're at it by traveling right on over to adventuresunlimitedpress.com to purchase books from many of our famed experts featured here on Truth Be Told.
You know, my listeners know I'm a huge history buff.
Huge!
I recently watched a documentary on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, and I found it so fascinating, and it highlighted the African-American Union soldiers that contributed to winning the war.
See, I'm fascinated by the same topic. Now, our esteemed guest today is Harry Jones. Mr. Jones is the Assistant Director and Curator of the Washington, D.C.-based African American Civil War Freedom Foundation and Museum. He is one of the foremost authorities on the role of African Americans in the Civil War.
Harry's refreshing new perspective on this subject reveals just how extensive and well-organized Americans of African descent were in their efforts to end slavery and gain their rights as citizens in league with the Constitution.
Harry is a content developer for the National Park Service and the museum at the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site at Tuskegee, Alabama, a content advisor for the American Civil War Center exhibits, Take Our Stand, as well as a content advisor for the National Archives and Records Administration exhibit, Discovering the Civil War. Television outlets, including the History Channel and the Public Broadcasting System, have also sought his expertise. Ladies and gentlemen, we're so proud to bring you Mr. Harry Jones.
The crowd goes wild for Harry Jones! How you doing, Harry?
I'm great, thank you. How are you this evening?
Wonderful. I'm here with Eddie Connor.
Hi.
How you doing, Eddie?
And the wonderful, beautiful Anna Garcia.
Hello.
Hello, Anna.
All right. Well,
Pleasure to be on with you.
Well, no, we're very honored to have you on, and this is so much fun because I've been for like 25 years. You know, I'm only 25 years old. Wrong. Eddie, yeah, okay.
You look 25.
Thank
That's
you,
all that
thank
matters.
you.
That's
If you have
true.
cataracts, yes.
Certain has the body of a 40-year-old.
But I love history, and going back into my family history, that I've had many of my ancestors, great-great-grandfathers that fought for the Union and fought for the Confederate, and so I love documentaries. I love watching History Channel and pretty much anything to do with the Civil War. And just the other day when I did watch this documentary, it blew my mind to think, wait a minute, we see so many documentaries and they talk about the Civil War, but they don't talk about the African-American soldiers that actually fought in the war. And so when I started looking it up, your name came up, and I said, I have to have him on the show.
It is one of the best kept secrets in American history. There are many secrets, but one of the best kept secrets in American history.
Well, something you told me when you emailed me, you said on April 3rd, 1860-something, you said there was something that happened, and I was curious if you could remind me what that was.
I am currently in Richmond, Virginia, to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the capture of Richmond, Virginia. On April 3rd, 1865, Richmond, Virginia was captured by the 25th Army Corps. What's significant about this 25th Army Corps, not only did they capture Richmond, but they're an Army Corps made up of only African-American regiments.
Wow.
So according to the official records, it's an indisputable historical fact that African American soldiers captured and occupied the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. And that's where I am right now to commemorate that.
That is awesome. Now, how did you get involved in this? I know, I believe I read that you actually had one of your great-grandfathers that fought in the war also. Am I right?
I did. Now, my great-great-grandfather was in a cavalry regiment out of Mississippi. It was initially called the 1st Mississippi Cavalry of African descent. He was a scout primarily in the cavalry, and later that regiment would be called the 3rd United States Colored Troops. And I grew up with his daughter, my great-grandmother, Big Mama Stella, as my principal tutor. And so she, from the time I was very young, in the early 60s, would remind me that he had helped save the Union and freed himself as a soldier in the Union Army.
Wow.
And also, I think, did I read, was it the first African American Corps? Was it in Massachusetts, 54th?
Well, that's a part of what I'm going to call the media myth.
Oh, okay. Well,
The 54th Massachusetts is presented as such, when in fact it is the 8th Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops or African descent soldiers. The first regiments are out of Louisiana. In 1862, before the Emancipation Proclamation, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Louisiana Native Guard, organized by Benjamin Butler, and had men like Captain Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, an African-American officer.
I love that name.
Major Ernest Dumas. These are also the first African-American officers who serve in American military.
Wow.
Would be in these units out of Louisiana.
Now, was the African Americans, were they meant from the beginning to fight, or were they, because a lot of men, especially white men back then, about African Americans carrying guns, were they meant to actually fight alongside, or were they brought aboard as other?
In a supporting role,
in a
perhaps.
supporting role, yeah.
That again is that's a very popular, now that's more than a media myth. That's an academic myth. That's something you'll get from the best scholars in the country. However, it's just not true. Benjamin Butler, who would organize the first African-American regiments down in Louisiana, he noticed from the very beginning how competent they were. In fact, he wrote, quote, "Indeed, I observed a very remarkable trait about them. They learned to handle arms and to march more easily than intelligent white men. My drill master could teach a regiment of Negroes that much more of the art of war sooner than he could have taught the same number of students from Harvard or Yale," close quote. He would go on to say, "Better soldiers never shouldered a musket," close. And so he clearly wanted soldiers that he thought were the best to go and fight. And in October of 1862, they would capture Donaldsonville, Louisiana. There were some officers who were hesitant to use African Americans, much like there were some football coaches who were hesitant to use African American quarterbacks.
So in this hesitancy, I'm curious, did this come about because there was a need, because they were short on soldiers? How did this actually come about?
It comes about as what Lincoln would at one time say that to Congress that they must take all indispensable means to save the Union. It was indeed a necessity. In the summer of 1862, General George McClellan lost the Peninsula Campaign with the largest army in the Western Hemisphere. And after word gets to Washington that McClellan's army is in full retreat, suffering a humiliating defeat, Congress then passes legislation to allow men of African descent to join the Federal Army.
So
now, it is important to note that in American history, African-American soldiers from the Revolutionary War of 1812 had been spoken very highly of by generals like George Washington and Andrew Jackson. So many of the more knowledgeable officers knew that indeed they would make good soldiers, and it was a military necessity for sure. And it was a political, difficult politically to get this through because Lincoln understood that by bringing African-American soldiers in, he would lose some support in the North.
Wow.
I couldn't even imagine what it would have been like to be alive back in that time, understanding both sides of the fence, and then having family members. Some fathers were against sons, et cetera, and having all of this on top of it. I'm really curious about something, Harry. when the African Americans were first brought in to fight, how much discrimination was there with the white soldiers and them, and just how awful did some of it get?
Well, it was a difficult situation because of the racism. However, the generals who are really interested in winning, they control this very well, and they are very active in trying to ensure that there is a climate which will bring the best out of the African American soldiers. So it's not as bad as we would actually think it was. And I'll just give you an example of what I mean by that. There were 5 occasions in which an officer flogged, which was illegal in the Union Army, beat an African American soldier for a violation of regulations. Of those 5 officers, 3 were killed by the soldiers.
Oh.
2 were court-martialed and kicked out of the service. When the 3 were the 3 men who killed the European American officer, when they were court-martialed, the judge advocate actually reversed their sentence and said it was justifiable homicide.
Wow. I'm very shocked, but I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, and it is surprising to hear it, to be honest with you.
And when you really begin to examine their service, they get a number of advocates, and I use this analogy with sports often because it is very similar with NCAA football or basketball. Once people realize how good they are, those who really want to win, they go with them, and they want to support them, and they want to keep them on the battlefield. They want to keep them ready, and so they work with them because Congress, when they authorized African Americans to join the Federal Army, they also mandated that they would receive less pay.
Yep.
About 50% less pay.
Yep.
And then you have generals like Benjamin Butler who would come up with workarounds where he would assign an African American soldier extra duty, and then he'd give them extra pay.
Good.
And then he would also give vouchers to their families so they could come into the commissary and purchase things to make up for this lack of pay. And then in June of 1864, Congress does amend the legislation awarding them equal pay. And when you read the congressional records, they're very clear that this is happening because they're making such good soldiers.
And that is also, didn't they also make it retro active so that any pay that they were without also got made up over the months and the years?
They did get arrears, that's correct.
Yeah, and I also think I remember reading somewhere that the white officers did not have to pay like $3 or $5 a month or whatever for their uniform or whatever the deal was, but the African American soldiers, they took that out of their salary as well.
That's correct. That's again until June of '64. That was by regulation, mandated by Congress. That was the regulation.
So did the blacks actually volunteer, or were they pressured, or were they forced? How did they end up in the military?
About 150,000 of the 207,000 who served are enthusiastic enlistees. They are excited about the opportunity, and many of those had been trained before the Civil War. A large number of them had been trained actually by the British in Canada, Upper Canada, or Ontario, we'd call it today.
I did not know that.
And were they received differently by the British or the Canadians? I guess there was no Canada then.
there was a tradition, in particular in Upper Canada, that dates back to the War of 1812, where Afro-Canadians were very important in the War of 1812 in defeating U.S. forces that tried to invade Canada. Then in 1837, there was a rebellion in Upper Canada, and African Americans, private individuals, not officially in any organization, helped the British Army put down the rebellion. So there was this sense of gratitude toward African Americans in Upper Canada. And John Bull, which is the equivalent to Uncle Sam, were fatefully aligned, and this is using a term from William Steele, one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad, that they were faithfully aligned with John Bull, which means really they were getting their military training from the British military.
What was the difference between the North and the South when it comes to the numbers of black soldiers? I'm sure the South forced the black soldiers to fight for the Confederate.
Or try
Well,
to.
what the South, the Confederacy, what they do is they force thousands of African Americans, free and enslaved, to work in what we call combat service support. So they were laborers for the Confederacy, but the laws were very strict on not to issue them weapons.
Wow.
It was probably smart.
So they're actually slave labor force for the Confederacy, and not officially in the Confederate Army. The Confederacy does pass legislation in March of 1865, authorizing African Americans to be enlisted into the Confederate Army, and actually emancipating them upon enlistment. But that legislation isn't signed into law until the 25th of March, and 8 days later, the Confederate government is withdrawing from Richmond.
Wow. What was the most haunting piece of material that you came across in all of your research, Harry, that literally brought you to your knees, or that brought you to tears, that just broke your soul open when you were doing your research?
You know, I honestly, I don't think I had that kind of a moment, mainly because of kind of a hardened sense of warfare that comes out of being a child that grew up paying very close attention to what was happening in Vietnam, and then being a Marine myself, and seeing things that really were quite disturbing. So being able to look at it in terms of the history, it's very clinical and not as it's just not as dramatic as what I'd seen of warfare and expected of warfare in my lifetime.
That's interesting, Harry. So, you see this almost from the point of view of a soldier, and you are cataloging the history of the black soldier.
Correct.
It's very interesting, soldier to soldier.
Yeah. Do you? This is me being all esoteric and woo-woo. My bad. Do you feel like it's part of your soul destiny to be doing what you're doing right now?
I certainly do. I feel called to it. Even if I wanted to get away from it, I get pulled into it.
Okay. Yeah, that's absolute life purpose, and that's something you can't. It's almost like you can't control it. It keeps not haunting you in the bad way, but almost pulling your heartstrings right back into it until the stories are told in a way, hopefully, that it will go out into the world and then re-educate the mass population.
Yes.
So tell us about the African American Civil War Memorial Museum. When did it actually start? Because I didn't even know there was one. So
now the memorial, the actual statue, there's a statue called the Spirit of Freedom. Mm-hmm. And on the walls behind the statue, you have the 209,145 names of all the soldiers and officers that served in the Bureau of United States Colored Troops. Now, this would not only be African American soldiers that served, but this would include the officers who were not African American, and some enlisted men, some non-commissioned officers who are in the U.S. Colored Troops. That memorial was dedicated on July 18th, 1998. The sculptor is Ed Hamilton, and it's a beautiful piece of artwork. It's a bronze statue, 3 soldiers and a sailor, and in the back of it you see the emancipated family. And then there's this. He gives a face to the Spirit of Freedom, and you actually see it above the soldiers. Then the wall has the names of all the soldiers, so there are a number of descendants who go to the memorial and find their ancestor's name on the wall of honor. For all of my family, whenever they came to Washington, I made sure they got to that wall to see.
I bet.
To actually have 2 great-great-grandfathers, actually 1 great-great-grandfather and 1 great-great-great-grandfathers whose name is on the wall.
That's amazing. I mean, I that's what I love about history, is because I think everybody really should know where they come from, and to know what powerful men that they, and women that they descend from. And I think that's what's important about what you're doing. What exhibits do you have currently that people might want to go see, or something that maybe even are doing a traveling exhibit?
The current exhibit is Glorious March to Liberty. And in this exhibit, we actually cover from 1619, the arrival of Africans on ships in Jamestown, 1619, to really 2008. But it focuses on the Civil War. And one of the things I'm going to say I boast about this exhibit is that when I did the development of it, wrote the script, curated it, I used only primary sources. So if you were not there in the making of the history, you do not get a quote in our exhibit. You have to be there to get a quote.
You can't buy your way in, huh, Harry?
Not at all. Not at all.
It's like the Consumer Reports of great information. Now, I'm going to sort of jump script just a little bit here. I'm fascinated by that whole timeline in the 1800s and before that. African Americans being brought over here, the slave trade and that sort of thing. And I'm working on a trilogy. And I am curious, what state in the United States, in your opinion, do you think had the heaviest saturation of blacks being brought over from Africa to become slaves? What do you think, at the southeastern part of the United States or other parts? What are the heaviest saturated states back in the day where we're bringing in these African Americans and turning them into slaves?
Number one would be South Carolina. Number two, Louisiana.
That's crazy. I'm fascinated by this. Now, and today I have friends who love South Carolina, and when they go there, they say you can literally feel the history vibrating off the pavement and off the walls and the buildings and the windows and the trees from decades and decades and decades and decades of things that should have never happened, like the slave trade, and then just the soldiers and the spirits there. Have you ever been to South Carolina and felt any of that?
I am moved in South Carolina. I would say that my first trip to Charleston, I stumbled onto what I was looking for without knowing that that's what I was looking for. Mm. So I really felt guided, if you will, because I found a number of things that were quite significant when I was in Charleston, and so it's been. I'm going to use the term magical, or it's probably a better term is spirit guided for me. Yeah. Whenever I've been down to South Carolina.
Well, I love that term, spirit guided. And what about a lot of people like New Orleans, Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen, and that sort of thing? How was that area, that part of the state in Louisiana around the New Orleans area, was that not as saturated as Mississippi, as you said earlier?
Oh, yes. Now, New Orleans is a major port of entry. Charleston and New Orleans are major ports of entry. And the history in New Orleans is just, with the African American community, it's more rich in resistance and sophisticated resistance than in South Carolina. Yeah. In South Carolina, the African American community in the urban area, in the urban areas, are really subdued. So in Charleston, they are really subdued by the time you reach, for example, 1860. Whereas New Orleans, in that urban area, they are really quite sophisticated and really quite duplicitous as well. They trick the Confederates quite a bit. They deceive them. In South Carolina, you have this going on as well, but I will admit that I have not been out to the Sea Islands where those individuals were most active.
Wow, I'm so fascinated by this. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Truth Be Told with Tony Sweet. I'm Eddie Connor.
I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Anna Garcia.
And we're speaking with Harry Jones right now. He is a content developer for the National Park Service Museum and also connected to the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site at Tuskegee, Alabama, and also a content advisor for the American Civil War Center exhibits Take Our Stand. I could talk to you all day long, but I'll get off topic. I know I will, because I'm more fascinated about the spirit part, the soul part, the energy, the spirit guide part that you were talking about earlier. So I'm going to leave it over to the professionals, and I'm going to jump in a minute so I don't dominate with like spirit stuff.
No,
Well,
that's really important. That's
very
what we're
important.
talking about. I mean, a soldier is far more than that. It is the
Yes.
person and the spirit of that individual and that individual's impact on history. So you can't separate the two. At least I don't think so. I don't care how hardened a soldier you are.
Yeah, I think that's so true because intention is everything. Intention is something that lives and breathes even after the body is not here. And I just wonder, when you're writing away, Harry, when you're sitting there in the middle of the night writing your material and getting ready to share it to the world, how often do you literally feel your ancestors on your shoulders behind you, supporting you and moving you forward with this information?
It would be easier to answer this if you were to ask me, how often do I not feel it?
Oh, good answer.
We knew we were going to get to your soft, mushy middle.
I know. That's the part. The soft, mushy soul.
That's all right. We're going to get to it, Harry, one way or another. I actually want to ask about women and black women at the time and what their roles were and what did Harriet Tubman do in all of this?
Love it.
Well, Harriet Tubman was one of those individuals who gets trained by the British military. And she's very competent in what we would call today special operations.
Oh.
She is a team leader or commander, and she leads raids. She goes behind enemy lines, gathers intelligence. She is very prolific at her work and extremely capable. A commander of men and women on the battlefield. I should say on the Special Forces battlefield. She's special ops. She's working usually with small units and, again, leading raids. Another woman of great significance in the leadership of this secret African-American organization that was referred to as the Loyal League is Mary Ann Shadd Cary. Mary Ann Shadd Cary is brilliant. She later becomes a lawyer. She was a school teacher. But she is a leader and a propagandist as well. She had a newspaper that she founded and edited called the Provincial Freedman out of Chatham, Canada. And she is the only woman to be commissioned a recruiting officer during the Civil War.
Wow.
The governor of Indiana, Oliver Morton, commissioned her in March of 1864. Now, just as a comparison, we often hear about Frederick Douglass as a recruiter.
Yes.
Frederick Douglass is a recruiting agent. Recruiting agents work for recruiting officers. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was a recruiting officer.
You go,
Then there's
Mary Ann.
scores
You
of other
go.
women. Of all the years I've studied, that's the first I've ever heard about that with Harriet Tubman and Mary Ann. That's fascinating. What is the biggest misconception we've been taught about African Americans in the Civil War, in your opinion, Harry?
The biggest misconception about African Americans is in the Civil War. Depends on what people did, but the biggest misconception is they didn't do anything, and the generals didn't intend for them to fight.
That they weren't even there
That
or
would be
part
the
of it.
biggest.
That I think that you're basically saying that most of us don't know that at the time that blacks were helping in this war.
That's correct.
Okay.
And the way it's presented, and even today, in the 150th anniversary of the fall of Richmond, there are also these neat little lines that are used that cause what I'm going to call well-meaning scholars to misunderstand. For example, the capture of Charleston, February 18th, 1865. African American soldiers captured Charleston. It is said that they didn't capture it; they just entered it.
They were holding it. Is that it? They were holding it until the whites arrived? Is that what
the
they were saying?
Confederates decided to leave and to give it to them as a gift, I guess.
Oh,
But that's what's said by leading scholars. Oh, no, they
Wow.
didn't capture it because the Confederates left. Oh, the Confederates defended it for 4 years, but they just left and said, okay, African Americans, you can have it, you know. And then with Richmond, most people don't like to say African Americans captured it. They like to say they entered it first.
oh my Lord! Wasn't there a huge slave uprising in Virginia prior to the Civil War?
Well, no, there had been some rumors of uprising and uprisings through the years.
Yes.
But mostly, by the time we reach after Nat Turner's demonstration, notice what I just called it, please.
Yes.
After Nat Turner's demonstration, it was very difficult because the Loyal League would not allow, if they had control of an area of an enslaved population, they would not allow an insurrection.
Wow.
They would not allow a rebellion because they were waiting. They were their phrase was "Stand still and see the salvation." The forecast was that North and South would bring sword against sword, brother against brother, and that there would be a parting of a Red Sea of blood, and through that Red Sea of blood you would pass to be free.
Wow.
So that was the forecast. So there was opposition within the African American community to rebellions by people who sought their freedom but would do it in league with the Constitution at the proper time. And those individuals, it's actually key to watch which rebellions they will refer to. And when I use the term rebellion, I'm going to use the way it's taught in the schools. Gabriel Prosser in Virginia, 1800. Denmark Vesey in Charleston, 1822. And Nathaniel Turner in Virginia, Southampton County, in 1831. Now, the people who mentioned their names, they disagree with insurrections. So that's why I call Nat Turner's activities a demonstration, because that's what they called it. They were demonstrating to the planter class that if you do not set the captives free, there's going to be a bloodletting. You're going to pay for this with blood. Denmark Vesey in South Carolina, he did not really plan an insurrection. What he was doing, he was preaching a continuous sermon. When I say, I shouldn't say continuous, repeatedly he would preach this sermon that forecasted, he was prophesying that the day would come when Charleston would be burned to the ground and ships would be commandeered and take people to freedom. And that's the sign that you would be emancipated. Well, I do want to point out that during the Civil War, on December the 11th, 1861, Charleston was burned down from the Cooper to the Ashley River. And on May 12th, 1862, Robert Smalls, who later becomes a congressman, commandeered a ship. So Charleston was burned down, a ship was commandeered. And in Virginia in 1800, Gabriel warned of a rebellion. Well, Gabriel is the archangel of warning. That's a sign. That's again telling you there's going to be a price to pay. And so when we deal with this group of people that are using this language, they are very much people who believe that they live in God's providence and that there is a time there's a time for everything. There's a season for everything, and the season of emancipation was coming, and it was going to be in league with the Constitution. All they had to do is stand still and see the salvation.
That is absolutely remarkable to me.
I do. I love it.
Harry, if there's denial of blacks in the Civil War, is there also a denial of any kind of recognition or any kind of medals of valor that are due some outstanding soldiers at that time?
Great question.
Well, it's interesting. For many years, especially before I got into this business, it was common among people in my business, in the museum business and academia, to say that the first African American to receive the Medal of Honor was William Carney, and he received the medal on May 23rd, 1900. Okay, now, May 23rd, 1900. Now, the true story is that William Carney was the 51st African American to receive the Medal of Honor.
Wow.
The first African American to receive the Medal of Honor was April 16, 1864, Robert Blake. There would be he was a sailor. There would be 7 sailors that received the Medal of Honor for acts of courage during the Civil War, and they would receive their medals before the end of the war. So within 6 months of their action, they would receive their medals. So it was rather quick turnaround. The soldiers, African American soldiers, there were 18 that received the Medal of Honor. 15 of those 18 would receive their Medal of Honor within 2 years of their act of courage. The other 3 would be 1900, 1912, and 1999. So he was not, of course, not alive to receive his medal posthumously. But they were in the Civil War. An African American soldier who sided for the Civil War, for the Medal of Honor, was more likely to receive that medal than in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and that is a strange and outstanding fact to me.
Wow.
What do you think is behind that?
That racism in the early 20th century, when Southern officers take over the military, in particular under Woodrow Wilson, have a propaganda campaign that is intense, that wants to whitewash African American military history. And the impact has been huge on American society and on African American scholars. Most African American scholars I know, when they deal with some of the top military men in American history, like Major Martin Delany, they use a definition and description of Delany that comes from the Ku Klux Klan.
I was going to ask that.
Wow.
They call him a black nationalist. The reason the Ku Klux Klan called Martin Delany a black nationalist, because they wanted to say that he wasn't a true patriot. Now, Martin Delany calls himself a true American patriot. But the Klan said he was trying to build a black empire to justify their acts of violence against the people he was organizing. So today, 90% of the African American scholars I know, especially in Ivy League institutions, in fact, I will say 100% of them, call him a black nationalist. That comes from the Ku Klux Klan, from Woodrow Wilson and other white supremacists. It does not come from Delany at all.
I think you
But
need to
that's
build
the
a new
effect that it's
museum.
Yeah.
You need a new museum. You got a few more wars to go.
Yeah.
Well, talk
You
about
know, one of the things that I get involved in a lot is paying attention to the history of rhetoric.
Yeah.
So where do people get what they're saying from? Who said it first? And that has been really eye-opening, because I'm finding that there are a lot of people studying African American history that they're quoting African Americans who made the history. They're quoting men like Woodrow Wilson, who was a diehard white supremacist.
Yeah,
I did not
I
even
was
know
going to
that.
ask, back in the day, via all of your research and your colleagues doing the research, Harry, how much of the political BS was there back then, meaning we're just going to say what we want to say, screw everybody else, they'll believe us because we're going to print it in the newspaper. How much of that was there back then versus all of the BS we get to see today?
Now, I didn't quite understand the question. There's a little bit of an echo.
Oh, okay. Back in with all of your research and your colleagues researching everything they've done so far, how much BS and rhetoric was there back then in political agenda, secret political agenda back then versus what we see a lot of today?
It was the foundation of what we hear today.
Wow.
And you see it, if I go to the congressional records and in the newspapers that come out that are mostly party records, that's most of the propaganda you still hear today. And you track it. If I go to Congress, the person I look to is Robert Roosevelt of New York. And yes, he's the uncle of Teddy and Ellen. And you can hear it in his speeches on the floor of the House. Then they're mostly Democratic newspapers. And then today, you can see this again repeated. And it's interesting because it still remains mostly a Democratic Party propaganda, even today.
Wow. Wow.
And I say that because there's this weird little thing going on with the political parties where you hear it. With the Republicans from the South, you can hear a bit of it because a large number of the Republicans in the South, they're not the planters. They're not descendants of planters. They're descendants of patrollers. And the patrollers are the people who were required by the planters to keep African Americans on the plantations. Most of the descendants of planters are still Democrats, and they led the propaganda effort. And so it's still quite prevalent today. You can pick it out of speeches easily and see the tradition of Robert Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt into today's modern day politicians. You can actually hear it.
With all of the books and the movies and TV shows and things, well, there's not a lot of them actually, but with the few movies and TV shows and books that are out there, in your opinion, for Tony's audience, What is the closest depiction of what you know to be true about African Americans during the Civil War that you would encourage us to check out before your movie and your book is done?
Wow.
I know it's sad, isn't it?
Well, it's Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood's never really going to be that accurate to begin with, no matter what the topic, and even less so, I think, in this situation.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know, I really wouldn't pick one. One of the things I would do, I would pick a movie that shocked your idea of what was to a degree that would open you up to understand it, and that would be Django Unchained.
Really?
Yeah, that will shock you enough, and to do it. There's an older movie that I might be closest in the sense of his sense of self. That's similar to that. I think it's named Joshua. It's a 1976 movie where he's a African American soldier returning from the Civil War. These gentlemen have killed his mother, and he chases them all down to take them out. That movie would also kind of capture the kind of dignity these men felt. So these would be movies I would give to someone to kind of shock them into making a paradigm shift.
Wow.
But I wouldn't call it accurate. I'm simply using these as shock that would open their minds up to understand how respectable, dignified, and courageous these men were, and women.
And women, yeah, I love that.
Well, before we go, I didn't get you out of here because I know you just got to the hotel room when we called you. But I want to know, for people like myself, but there's a lot of African American people out there that would love to do research to find out more about, if their family was part of the Civil War or played a part in it. Do you have a lot of records at the museum that people can look at, maybe to do some research?
We have them, but we're in Washington, and we will never rival the National Archives.
Right.
And the National Archives, I would say your tax dollars have gone to work in a very constructive way, making these records easily accessible.
Good.
And the National Park Service has even made them accessible online so that you can be introduced to it. Now, if you want to do further research, you need to go to Washington, go to the National Archives. But you can go online to National Park Service Soldiers and Sailors Index, and you can go there and at least find out, do that preliminary research, and then as you dig deeper, go to the National Archives. So we, at the museum, we do not match what the National Archives can do. We encourage and we work with the National Archives.
Wonderful. Now, are we going to see you on one of the television outlets soon, either History Channel or PBS or something coming up, so we can get Tony's fans to check you out and support your vision?
Well, I will be on. Let me see. I'll be on a program. History Channel has their final kind of Civil War culmination of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, sesquicentennial Civil War. And they interviewed me for that, and I think I made the director's cut.
Okay.
Then there are a couple of PBS programs, one at the end of this month on the draft.
Oh.
And so I'll be talking more about my more contemporary military service there.
Fantastic.
And my views on the draft, and give you a good history of the draft, because we sometimes think that the draft is something that was a part of American society, when really it was something very new and was not something that Americans thought was good until the late 20th century, mid to late 20th century.
Wow.
And then there's another program on the White House. I'm not sure when that's coming out. And let me see. There's another I can't mention that one yet. I can't do that. That's on network television, and they told me in my contract I can't talk about it until they market it.
Wow.
Okay.
Well,
yay, Harry.
Well, you can go to Harry Jones. That's HARI Jones.com to check out all about where Harry's going to be and about his past and his experience. Or you can go to afroamcivilwar.org, and I'm going to make a donation, and I think everybody out there should make a donation to this museum. It's such a great cause, and it's a beautiful museum from what I see, and I can't wait to get to Washington, D.C. and stop in and see it. So But Harry, we thank you so much for taking the time and giving us this history lesson, because I think this is something that we all need to know the truth.
Yes.
Like truth be told.
There you go.
But thank you so
It
much,
was
Harry.
my pleasure.
All right.
Thanks,
Harry
Harry.
Jones,
Thank you,
everybody.
Harry.
Have a great evening. Thank you.
too.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Wow. Yeah, I love Harry.
I
too.
love Harry.
I know.
We all love Harry.
Yes, we do.
This man, you can tell, is pure knowledge. To remember every date, that's impressive. I can barely remember when I was born.
But when you love something as much as he does,
Right, you
when
can
his
tell.
soul is guiding him the way his is, it just rolls out of him like a wellspring.
Yeah, and you can tell that he's keeping these spirits alive. That's 150 years old, and I'm so glad that he stopped in and said all kinds of info for us.
Well, on a separate weird note, in my book, whenever I'm writing, I write late at night when the phone's not ringing, the computer's not on. But long story short, that's the 2 ports of call out of all of the ones in the United States that my character stopped in was New Orleans.
Oh,
The
really?
mother gets sold there, and then the daughter is sold in Charleston, South Carolina. I was like, that's crazy.
Can you think about? I mean, you have to think about the millions of slaves.
Oh,
Millions of slaves that died in captivity. I mean, that just baffles me.
just
to think.
just between their shore and this shore, just
Yeah.
in the middle passage before they ever step foot on land.
Right, and because they said over 500,000 people, 500,000 people died in the Civil War. Like I think it was 600,000 something.
Yep.
I mean, that's nothing compared to how many slaves died, and it's just so sad. But you hate to see a war like that, but it had to be done. It had to be done. Did you ever study Civil War?
No, not that much. I was actually thinking of something you said, Ed, when you were asking about, when you asked Harry, do you ever get a feeling when you go somewhere? And I had a vision in my head. It was geographically nearby of Savannah, and I just remember they would take pieces of glass, like the really thick glass, and take shards of the glass and put them on top of the buildings to keep the slaves from jumping out of the homes in the greater Savannah area.
Oh, wow.
And I remember taking a walking tour of Savannah, and when I saw that, that image is still stuck in my head. There are so many far worse images, obviously, but it's there. Like, it's a physical remembrance of that time and that place and how much blood was shed. I was just fascinated by Harry.
I was too.
I would love to meet him. I would love to go out to D.C. and meet him.
And those shards of glass, I mean, they carry energy. There's a story, and there was an intention behind it, with the intention behind the slaves. It's compounded and compounded. That's why I love the South, because there's so many stories that aren't told unless you can whisper it to your soul.
I had a colleague and friend of mine, and she's African American from New Jersey, and every year she and her family would go down to the South to meet the white cousins and that family, and that family had decided, as black and white members of the family, that they had traced their roots and that they would be one. And
oh, wow, you don't hear that too often.
you don't, and I think that probably happens maybe a little bit more now than people talk about. And I'd love to hear those kinds of stories, because the challenges of what it is to be that family is, to me, the story of this country.
What
Especially right now.
and the parts of the country they live in, compounding the challenges on top of that. And families, they have their own little laws. They make up their laws as they
Oh,
go.
they
They're never written down. They're never they're in stone, but they're never written down, and they change every 30 seconds. So every time something happens, you just get the look, and if you ever talk about that, you're dead. Period.
Right.
So wonder we carry so much stuff around inside of us, but that That would be a great movie.
That would be.
That would be a great
That's
story.
a Tyler
wouldn't
Perry
it?
movie right there.
It is such a great movie. Yeah,
Yeah,
she's a reporter in New York, actually.
I love Tyler Perry, but I don't think he would write that movie the way I think it should be.
Right.
Well,
no.
maybe you should do it, Ed.
Yeah.
Come on,
Oh,
Eddie.
Well,
Come on.
I'm working on it. Moon Shadows: A Walk Between Worlds.
Oh, I love that title.
Thank you.
I'm curious, though, because you're so spiritual. If you have all of this DNA floating around and we're all connected, or let's say the family, let's say the descendants of a slave owner and a slave, and the family members, both the white and the black,
Yeah.
and then we go forward a few generations or many generations, that DNA continues to be carried in there. What do you think is the spiritual connection to the science of that?
I think the spiritual connection to the science of it is what you just said. We are all one, and we have our stuff we have to get over and evolve and grow and expand our consciousness in as individuals, and let go of all of these limited BS beliefs that we've been constantly taught, and take a stand. And you got to find sort of a diplomatic way. We don't have to find a diplomatic way to do it. You can just go out there barrels blazing and just, but I think it is to evolve into the conscious awareness that we're one, and then move toward that in a way to where you inspire other people to move with you, because they're wanting to expand consciousness and have peace too.
Interesting.
Eddie, so smart. All right.
So-
All right.
and on that note,
Anna, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
bringing
Thank
the
you.
beauty and the brains and
know.
the finesse child.
And my eyes are like watering. My sinuses. Sorry, I sound like a wah, wah. Yeah. Oh well.
You sound like a handicapped duck. Wah, 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 wah. And it's Easter.
It is. Happy Easter, everybody.
Yeah.
And Eddie, as always, thank you.
Thank you.
And everybody, come back next Friday. We have the one and only, one of the top mediums in the world.
Ooh.
Lisa Williams.
Yes, Lisa Williams.
She's phenomenal.
Phenomenal.
Really?
Yeah, numero uno.
Yeah, she's like number 3 of, I think, or probably
In
to
our
us,
life, she's number one.
number 1. Yes.
I'm knocking on the door.
Okay.
I'm coming in.
She's
Knock,
coming
knock,
in.
knocking on Lisa's door.
Knocking on. All right, it's time to get out of here before I start singing. All right, take care, guys. Truth be told, with Tony and Eddie and Anna Garcia.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Bye.